Yeah, I think so. Yeah, it's good to be back. I almost feel like this is my home away from home. It's my fourth visit here, actually. And I think when I did my third one, I said something like, I like it so much here, I'm going to write another book so I can come back. And I don't know if I've got any more left in me. I'm running out of gas. But yeah. So as was explained, I grew up in Georgia, and so I didn't really know a lot about Chinese culture and so forth. I received this shirt actually last weekend. I gave a talk on this in San Francisco. Leland Wong, I don't know if any of you know, he's a graphic artist and photographer in San Francisco, Chinatown. He has a Facebook page called We Grew Up in San Francisco, Chinatown. It's a pretty interesting website because a lot of people talk about their experiences there, so I've been reading that. So I didn't technically grow up in San Francisco, Chinatown, although I did spend my teen years there. So I'm kind of like a member of this group with a little asterisk by my name. All right, so starting out with this little quotation from a Chinese author whose book, Eat a Bowl of Tea, was made into an independent film. Probably came out, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago. Some of you may have seen it. If not, it's a very thoughtful film about the life of the Chinese immigrant bachelors in San Francisco, Chinatown. And so he makes a couple of points about Chinese restaurants. So the second point is sort of the contrast of the first point, which kind of leaves us, who really understands Chinese restaurants? There are a lot of things that maybe we have stereotypes and misconceptions of, and part of what I'm going to be talking about today are some of the historical trends or factors that influence Chinese restaurants in the United States and also in Canada and a lot of other countries. Why did I pick a title that has this sweet and sour? Well, obviously, I'm not referring to the dish that goes under that name, but I want to quote from a person who grew up in a Chinese restaurant who wrote to me when I told him I was working on this and I interviewed him. And he talked about why sweet would be appropriate, because this is a way for his family, which had no other means of economic survival. So there was some definite sweetness to it. But the flip side was it was a hard life. It was long hours every day of the week. Customers were often difficult to deal with, and so there was a negative side. So it's kind of interesting that there are so many Chinese restaurants. There was a quote recently, and it's even on CBS News, 47,600. I don't know who actually counted them, but we'll go and say that's fairly close, accurate estimate. Yet, 150 years ago, when the Chinese first started opening little cafes, they were not really that popular among non-Chinese. In fact, they were not patronized at all, probably. So to go from 0 to 46,700 is pretty amazing. So being a college professor, we sometimes give multiple choice exams, so let's look at it from that sort of perspective. Is this the correct answer? These people weren't restaurateurs, or the men who opened these restaurants were not cooks in China, in their villages. They were farmers, and they did not come for the purpose of opening a restaurant, clearly. So someone might think, oh, Chinese food is so well known that the white people really say, oh boy, they're opening a Chinese restaurant, let's run out and try some. Well, that wasn't true either, as I'll point out in more detail. This one depends on who you talk to. I talked to people who ran laundries and said, oh, this is hard work, I wish I had a restaurant. And I've talked to people from the other perspective as well, and I met a few people who actually did both. They switched back and forth depending on what was more lucrative. So that one's kind of a toss-up. You could say that Chinese didn't know how to do anything else. Well, that's kind of a moot question. They actually did try and did succeed in a lot of other things. Mining, manufacturing, they worked in lumber, they did fishing, they did construction, but eventually they were excluded because of competition with white labor, and Chinese were left to fend for themselves, mainly in doing domestic types of activities. And by domestic, I mean things like cooking for other people, which would eventually be cafes, doing laundry, washing clothes for other people, being houseboys, doing domestic service, in other words. So the true answer, like in many college exams, none of the above or all of the above. In this case, probably none of the above. Now, everyone knows that in 1882 there was an official exclusion of Chinese immigrant laborers into the United States. And this picture is like worth 1,000 words. The impact on Chinese community, where there were multiple numbers of Chinese, unlike myself in Georgia, where I was the only, my family was the only one. If you went out on the streets of Chinatown, that's what it looked like. Notably absent are any women or children, so there was no family life. It was the so-called bachelor society, right? So these men needed some sort of refuge or community gathering center, and so the Chinese cafe sort of served that purpose. And as quoted in a doctoral dissertation from back in 1922, basically they're saying, you know, the cafes were more than places to eat. These were places where the Chinese in a hostile environment could feel comfortable among their fellow compatriots. They could, you know, use chopsticks instead of knives and forks. They could wear their native costumes. They didn't have to feel uncomfortable, in other words. And they could have a slug of cafe and, you know, kind of relax with each other and gamble and so forth. Here are a couple of early images of some of those cafes, what they might look like. You might even say that possibly Starbucks got its business model from looking at some of these images. These are hangouts. These are places where people just go together, just kind of sit and hang around and be with your fellow countrymen. Now, I know you can't read that probably that far away. That's something that I got from an early document showing like what would have been on the menu. What would have been on the menu would be clearly different from what's on a Chinese restaurant of any type today. This was more like village food, comfort food, soul food, and so forth. And things that would have been really peasant food, nothing elaborate for a banquet or anything. Now, question might be, as we pointed out before, most of these Chinese immigrants were not cooks, so how did they get their foot in the door? I mean, how did they even learn to cook? Well, one mechanism was through peripheral forms of employment, like working as houseboys, working on a railroad, not building a railroad, but in this case, some of them, like in a picture in Canada, there were porters and cooks on trains. And so they would be hired as houseboys and domestics, and they would be taught to cook, and they would learn American recipes, and they would learn how to bake American pies and American cakes. And so that's not cooking Chinese food, but that's like one step along the way to being able to open a Chinese restaurant, quote-unquote Chinese restaurant, because many of the Chinese restaurants outside of Chinatowns were actually serving American food. And so whether you want to call that a Chinese restaurant or not, it's kind of debatable, but this is how many of them made their livelihood. This one particular image from the 20s, I could have picked any of a number, but obviously there were far too many restaurants to show, but you can sort of see the really so austere environment. A lot of the early restaurants had little booths, a little privacy and so forth. Nothing fancy. This particular restaurant is sort of linked to a famous person. That's why I included it. A woman, Leland Wong, I believe was her name, and a book has been published in the last year about a collection of letters between Flora and a friend of hers, a Caucasian friend in Arizona, because Flora was a modern day, was for her time, a flapper. She was sort of an iconoclastic. She was not your typical Chinese American girl, and she rebelled against the restaurant. She hated the restaurant life and left it, and she went to Chicago and became a journalist and worked for newspapers and so forth. And so the point is just a little bit of digression, but the book is kind of interesting because the 20 some odd years of letters there, which kind of gives an insight into what life was like in China during the Second World War for a Chinese American who was trapped there with 2 young daughters. Here are some images of some early restaurants. These are not family restaurants. These are more elaborate, more, to some extent, geared to attract white clients as well. Typical on the right is a 3-story building. Many of the Chinese restaurants have living quarters for their staff, for their waiters, cooks, just other people who work in the restaurant, because they didn't always pay them or pay them very much. What they had to offer to them was room and board, and so they kept them very close to the premises of the restaurant. It would be like a living dormitory upstairs with maybe one bathroom down the hall and maybe 10 rooms that the workers would live in. Now, again, just to contrast this with family restaurants, here's an example of a very opulent restaurant. There were several open in Chicago, even as early as the early 1900s and maybe up to the 1920s. And then when the Depression came, a lot of these fell on hard times. But where did they get the money to open these kind of restaurants? One immigrant couldn't open a restaurant like this. Some of these restaurants actually entail investors, silent partners from China, who were thinking that maybe they could make money off of this and use it for political purposes in China. So Chen Foying, who was well known in Chicago, opened several of these restaurants. He was the manager of them. But later, I think they folded partly because it was implicated that he mismanaged the operations and so forth. But these restaurants, and here's another image of one in San Francisco with a similar name, Mandarin, and you can see that unlike the first restaurant in Fresno I showed you, this one even has a dance floor. And this was a total revelation to me when I first started looking at this. I didn't realize Chinese restaurants had dance floors on them. These are not dance floors for entertainers. These are dance floors for the patrons of the restaurant. So when you go wining and dining and dancing or whatever. So this was commonplace in the larger restaurants. But it wasn't unique to the Chinese restaurants. Other non-Chinese restaurants probably had them too. So that was the era where people did do this as a form of recreation. I guess maybe because they didn't have television and other forms, so that they would do this, or other clubs. Now, this restaurant, and I think some of you might know that this restaurant is related to Loma. Family. Her father came over and immediately got pressed into service when he was 12 or 14 years old. The book, American Paper Son, which is an excellent book, describes the story of her father's life. So he came over at 14 or something. He landed in Seattle. He took a train over to Wichita. They fed him, put him to bed. The next morning, started having him wash dishes. So he was right in there, right away. Now, you can see in this restaurant, it's pretty successful, very popular. There's really a mixed clientele. It's not just Chinese. And they had living quarters up above where, as I described before, the employees lived. and were fed and so forth. So this is an image from San Francisco that I brought just because we're dealing with the Bay Area. Down in Chinatown, you can see that no families, no women and children. This is a business lunch. Men are all wearing suits and so forth. Because you have to also remember that restaurants, not just Chinese restaurants, were not widely frequented 100 years ago. Restaurant as a business came about as the country became more industrialized. Prior to that, people just ate at home. They'd go eat out. Now, people eat out more than they eat at home, but it was the opposite back then. But at that transition point, the restaurant industry had to sort of sell itself and tell people, you need to go out and eat, get more out of life. Now, going to a Chinese restaurant was sort of a challenging thing because people, non-Chinese, were afraid to go to them for various reasons. The location, the novelty or the exotic aspects of the food. So they didn't really want to go to Chinese restaurants because they had certain images. And some of these images might be reflected in this image from a Washington newspaper. Here we have the restaurant. We have children bringing their dogs and cats. Not to be fed, by the way. So when you have this imagery in the popular media, it's not surprising that people might, think twice about going to a Chinese restaurant. This is an image from a newspaper article that Theodore Dreiser, the famous American writer before he became famous, this cartoon was published in conjunction with some article. You can see that these Chinese don't know how to use chopsticks. They got one in each hand. And even though you can't make it out, I suggest to you that in the front person, he has a rodent hanging out of his bowl of noodles. So clearly not a very appetizing prospect. There was concern about Chinese restaurants being a threat to white women, that white women were employed in either Chinese or Japanese restaurants, that they might be exploited, they might be sexually seduced, they might, be drugged with opium and these sorts of things. And those types of hysteria even led some communities to pass laws that would say you couldn't hire white women to work in a Chinese or Japanese restaurant. And one of the real secret concerns was reflected in this image, that there would be either interracial marriages or other sexual relationships between Asians and Caucasians. And that was kind of I won't say it was unstated, but often unstated, but often an underlying concern. Now, oddly enough, chop suey turned the tide for the Chinese restaurant. Nowadays, we would laugh at the idea that any self-respecting Chinese person would go to a restaurant and order chop suey. In fact, some places probably couldn't even find it now. But what happened, and there are different views of this, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I'll just mention a couple. In the East, in the big cities especially, because in 1896 a Chinese diplomat came and wanted Chinese food, and a chef didn't have anything to prepare, so he took some odds and ends and threw them together, and supposedly the viceroy really loved this tremendously, and the press wanted to write it up, and they said, "What is this stuff called?" So, telling them the truth, it's odds and ends, it's chop suey, or dap suey, or how we pronounce it. So the press picked this up and said, yeah, this chop suey is something that's rather prestigious. Thank you. And so that led to a lot of interest in it. Now in the West, on the other hand, because the viceroy didn't come out West, we have sort of a different story, that it's sort of like an in-joke. The in-joke being that miners, maybe not too far from here, near Sacramento or somewhere up in the gold country, accosted some Chinese restaurateur one night. They came in and they were hungry, they wanted food, but there was no food to be provided. So to save his life, the cook went and threw together all the scraps he could find and stir-fried it real quick and served it to them, and they seemed to love it. And so they said, what is it? You know, and so again, it was called chop suey. They didn't tell them it was odds and ends. So those are two sort of stories about how it originated. But in any case, back east especially, it became extremely fashionable for what we today call young urban professionals to go out in the evening to these dangerous places. I mean, you don't think of Chinatown as that dangerous nowadays, but you remember in those days, white people wouldn't go into Chinatown unless they were going for prostitution, opium den, some sort of gambling. There were all kinds of dangerous things going on there. So they would get together and they would go to Chinatown and slum and try chop suey because they wanted to check this out. Everyone's talking about chop suey. Let's go find out what it is. And I remember after I read this and I thought about it. Yeah, it does make sense because I remember doing some slumming in my youth. I lived in Chinatown, as you know, and a bunch of us youth would get together. We'd screw up our courage. We'd cross Broadway into North Beach so we could go stare at the beatniks, the beat generation. And for people who are younger than I and who didn't do that, if you lived in San Francisco in the 70s, you probably went slumming out Haight-Asbury to go and see all the hippies. So, you know, it's a common characteristic of people to be curious about these weird people. So chop suey became an attraction, even though there were all these dangers, as connoted in the web of evil, that there was a business. People were offering guided tours, you know, with security, of course, you know, we'll chaperone you through there, and you're as a ticket seeing San Francisco, you know, you get this ticket and they'll take you and show you all these dangerous places and maybe end up having chop suey somewhere. So, certainly by the 20s, if you look at photographs of different cities and restaurants and so forth, you cannot find a restaurant that doesn't have the word chop suey on the name somewhere. It was just almost a prerequisite. There were even songs. Louis Armstrong even had a jazz version about chop suey. So eventually Americans, by that I mean white society, sort of almost appropriated chop suey for themselves. They found that maybe it could be lucrative. We could package this. A Korean American and I think an Iranian American got together and formed a company called Le Choi. You know, ersatz Chinese food. It wasn't the real thing, but it was sort of like prepackaged food. You get this mix, and then you go and bring the meat and just add it together. And in case you can't figure it out, you know, white housewife trying to figure out this mysterious chop suey, don't worry. We have this genie, this Chinese chef hovering over you there in the next image in this ad, and we'll make sure that you get it right. It became part of the culture. I mean, even famous artists did paintings which implied that chop suey was part of the landscape. But as I said, you had to market any new product, and Chinese restaurants had to sort of market themselves, especially opportunities availed themselves after the Second World War. People became more prosperous and there were opportunities to do this. And so Chinese made themselves even more exotic. I mean, they played on this interest of, you know, being Oriental and to capitalize on it because that would be a drawing card for non-Chinese to want to try this new stuff. But the public really didn't know what they were getting into, as exemplified by a quotation from Prime Minister of England back in the 50s, I believe. Yeah, the 50s. In case you can't read it in the bag, I just love Chinese food. My favorite dish is number 27. Clearly reflecting a lack of full understanding of the cuisine. Restaurant menus would even print things on there to suggest to them that Chinese food was very healthy and was delicious and nutritious, and you know that you were so like basically, you know, selling people in case they were a little concerned and a little worried. Now, I think it's also interesting and instructive to look at Chinese restaurant names, because you can sort of see how they change over time, and that sort of parallels the sort of thing that I'm talking about. The early ones might have signs like this. So maybe a person who didn't know Chinese couldn't tell whether he was going into a restaurant or a laundry or a grocery store. So you had to communicate to the non-Chinese by maybe transliterating the names so that they could at least pronounce it, if nothing else. And there's Gokwa, and some of you may know from Grand Avenue in Chinatown, San Francisco. And so that was a reflection that they were not just dealing with Chinese customers. And then eventually some decided, well, we'll do both. We'll both put English names and Chinese names. And like as I talked about when I did the laundry talk about how a lot of those laundry names reflected what I call wishful thinking. Like a prime example would be one laundry's name translated to Forever Victorious, which in English sounds kind of silly. But here we have the Prosperity Restaurant, the Hosagai, Good Future or whatever. And then we have names that sort of hint on the patriotic. I was surprised when I first discovered all these Mayflower restaurants. I found one and I thought it was very odd that they would name it Mayflower. And then I found another one, and then I found another one. In fact, not too long ago I went on Google just to see if this was something that was present back in the 20s and 30s, but it's still present now. I found at least 50 Mayflower Chinese restaurants across the United States. So we didn't come on the Mayflower, obviously, but maybe this persuaded, non-Chinese, having a Statue of Liberty in front of the restaurant. We also had the servile names, in case that didn't bring, patriotism didn't bring you in. We, invoked Hop Sing from Bonanza, which would imply, we're going to be waiting on your hand and foot. And then we have some, on the demeaning side, I'd call it, invoking Dragon Lady and so forth. We have even risque ones. If you look on certain websites for photographs of Chinese restaurants, the Food King Chinese restaurant is probably the most photographed Chinese restaurant in America. With running second closest, the Hung Par Lo. This particular one is in Portland, and whereas it basically means red flower restaurant building, Caucasians tend to think it has some sexual connotation about male anatomy of great proportion. And last year there was a crisis in Portland because this historic sign landmark was taken down by city laws because they were worried it was going to get blown off by a windstorm and it might fall and injure someone. So they took it down, and there was a campaign for months in Portland to raise the money, the $50,000 or so, to resurrect their image of virility. And so the sign is back up, but the restaurant is gone, apparently. It got bought out by someone else who doesn't serve the same food, but the Portlanders seem to be happy. And, the names now have changed. The names are almost very commonplace, and I did a rough estimate. I figured that we could probably name any Chinese restaurant in America maybe 65% of the time correctly if we just choose one from column A and one from column B. So if you're going to open a Chinese restaurant, I'll be happy to loan you my list. Now, while if you look at American restaurants, especially the franchises, there's an urge to make them all look alike. It's almost like, that way people make sure that they come back again, so we make them like clones. But Chinese restaurants sort of defy description in some sense. They have a lot of uniqueness about each one, and yet, in a way, even without the Chinese words on them, if you looked at these images, you'd say, yeah, I think that's a Chinese restaurant. As I said before, they capitalize on the Orientalism, the interest in, being exotic. So pagodas and Buddhas and those dragons and other lanterns and so forth would be used on the exterior. The Chinese don't waste anything. We are good at recycling. And one of my favorite is the train station in New Hampshire. It's no longer trains going through there, now it's a Chinese restaurant. You see there's a KFC in Kentucky that we didn't change the building, we just changed the sign. If you look at the interiors, we can also find a lot of variation from one to another. It's sort of improvised, ad-libbed. One of my favorite ones is the one on the bottom right. It's got a little bit of everything in there, including, I think, the Statue of Liberty or something. But see, people don't go to Chinese restaurants for the ambiance so much as they do for the food, at least in the old days. Chinese restaurants are also very dangerous neighborhoods. A lot of them get robbed. There have been restaurateurs killed in, these environments, but that's, comes with territory. The menus in the so-called American Chinese restaurants, this is an old one, but I put this up partly to reflect the oldness of the old mimeographed menu. And even though you can't read it, the print's kind of small. Almost all the items are really American food. Yeah. There's, liver and onions or something like that, pork chops, meatloaf, Salzburg steak or something, a lot of pies, and maybe chow mein and chop suey and maybe egg rolls. But in the mind of people, this is a Chinese restaurant. And this would not be a Chinese restaurant probably that would likely survive in, say, San Francisco. But if you were out in the middle of, say, Nebraska or the middle of Kentucky, this might be what you'd find in those restaurants in those days. Now, what I'm really interested in all of the writings I've been doing is not so much about the businesses themselves, but about the immigrants who ran them and what their life was like. So in my book, Sweet and Sour, I was fortunate to enlist at least 10 different people who had ties to Chinese family restaurants to write about their experiences independently of each other, because I wanted to see what common experiences they had. And I take this theme from the documentarian, Canadian Chinese documentarian, Chok Kwan. He went to 15 different countries all around the world, including like Israel, Cuba, Norway, just to name a few, and he went and found people who ran Chinese restaurants. And so he says, not only is he going to get a good meal, or expects to get a good meal, but he'll also discover a personal story, a unique story of courage, survival, and hope. And I think that really kind of hits the nail around the head, because in the stories that I was able to collect, and some that I wasn't able to include, I think that's a common theme, and that's sort of partly what motivates me to engage in these writings. And here are just a couple of images that, that I'm sure will be familiar to some of you. Family-run businesses. And here's one in nearby Lodi, the new Shanghai restaurant. And as a special treat for you, I actually have someone who has a connection to the new Lodi restaurant. And I'm going to invite Leland Wong, Hornsby, who kindly agreed to come today and share some of her memories about experiences in that life. So please welcome Julie. Oh, yes, here.
Thank you and welcome everybody. I wanted to thank John and also to my cousin Mel Brown. It's my understanding when John was explaining this project to Mel, who was a writer himself, he replied that he indeed had married into a family that had a Chinese restaurant, and the mill offered his services to gather information as he was coming to California for a visit. And thus the story begins. My grandfather started this restaurant, and in a typical fashion, the family lived over the restaurant for many years. It wasn't until my parents took over the business that the restaurant moved across the street to a new, bigger location and we got to move into a real house. Interestingly, the story comes near the end of our chapter. John writes that my parents operated the popular eatery for another 25 years. Well, those were my years. The foundation of the restaurant had already been set, and my parents just continued it. The restaurant was part of our lives, and we didn't really think anything more than that. I had taken a series of photographs right before my parents sold the business, and I'm not sure why I did that, but I did. And when Noah was looking at them, he said, "Boy, these are really interesting pictures." I took pictures of the new Shanghai, and the picture you see here is actually in front of the old Shanghai. You don't see the neon sign, which had the predominant chop suey on it. But I do have a picture of the new Shanghai restaurant signage, which somehow lost the chop suey part of it at that point. But in the pictures that I took, I also took pictures of like a noodle machine that we had that was the size of a shopping cart. I always found that fascinating, because we made our own noodles. The row of the big woks, crocks of the salted eggs that we had in our basement. My cousin Mel had asked why I took these pictures before I did, or why I took the pictures that I did. And I think I was just trying to save the images from my past that I know once the restaurant changed hands, it was going to change. It's no longer, it's no longer ours. But this is where I grew up. When the restaurant moved across the street, it was much bigger. There was a banquet room. It was the largest Chinese restaurant in Lodi. Miss Lodi herself came and cut the ribbon at the grand opening. There was a picture of it in the paper. But like I said, we made our own noodles with the pasta machine. We had cha shell and barbecued spare ribs that we cooked in our own roaster. We even had our own setup in the back where we grew our own bean sprouts. Because a lot of the things weren't available, so we made them ourselves. When there was a lull in business, my dad put in a steam table for the buffet lunch. That was a favor for the after the church crowds on Sundays. And it certainly was a case of it takes a village. And my Uncle Jack would come over on the weekends, and if there was a big banquet going on, perhaps some of the other relatives would be recruited. And for quite a number of years, both my grandmothers were in Lodi, and they would oversee all the grandchildren. If the kids were younger, they could play in the big basement that we had downstairs. There was plenty of room to ride tricycles around. But it was still being very typical, and everyone got to help out. My Uncle Jack would come on the weekends, all the kids would be put to work. In my family, we had 4 older girls and 1 boy. And my cousins, there were 2 older girls and 1 boy. There seems to be a pattern. And with all these kids, we would all take orders into the kitchen, bust the tables, pack the takeout orders, whatever that needed to be done. Years before, there were little individual packages of the soy sauce. We would package our own. We all sat around the table as someone would dispense the soy sauce in the little plastic cups, and us kids would put the little plastic lids on. And we did that for the hot mustard, and we would put fortune cookies and tea bags and little white bags to go with the takeout orders. And thanks to all that training, I'm quite the good carrot peeler and shrimp sheller and an excellent fly swatter. While reading John's book, there was also a common thread in us teenage restaurant workers. Most of us didn't have much of a social life, as confirmed by my cousin buying the book. We didn't join many clubs or go to football games as we were in the restaurant helping out while we were doing our homework. One thing that I do remember is that when one works in a Chinese restaurant, one's clothes tends to smell like chow mein. I had clothes that I only wore on the weekends, as they went straight into the hamper as not to contaminate the rest of my clothes. And I think the restaurant was part of our lives more than we originally thought. Preparing for today, I was thinking about my grandmother's final ride from the funeral home to the cemetery. As it was customary, the procession made a couple pointing stops, one being my parents' home as she lived with us, and then also stopping at the restaurant as well. But the New Shanghai was also a gathering place. If you can imagine, we had Thanksgivings there. Thanksgiving being one of the few days that we were actually closed. My parents would invite quite a number of families. We had all the tables and plates that one would need, and the buffet steam table was ready to go. My dad would make a huge roast turkey, and there would be mashed potatoes, green beans, sweet potatoes, and bouffant. People would bring food, and somebody always brought onion rings, which I could never figure out. But then the visiting families and friends, they would also come to the restaurant because, you know, that's where my parents were. They would have something to eat and maybe to emotionally touch base. One of my cousins who was at John's lecture on Sunday, after seeing one of our pictures in the book, had exclaimed, "I remember that table." There was a large round table that the family and staff would have our evening meals. And she said we would sit there and visit all the time. When my parents decided to sell the business, I just remember them telling us right before the sale. I never asked them, but they didn't ask any of us if we were interested in the restaurant. At that time, a couple of us were married, some were off to college. I'm not even sure if any of us would have wanted to take over the restaurant. Maybe it was just not a big thing to them. Just something that somehow managed to provide for the family all these years, and hoping, as most parents do, that the children would go on to something better. And I wanted to finish with a story about the restaurant. It was during the fishing season, and a couple of Caucasian men, Ofan, came to the restaurant's back door and struck a deal with my mother in exchange for a big pot of salmon carcasses, because they had already filleted, you know, they took the prime fillets off already. They got a big order of Chinese food. I'm sure both parties were snickering, thinking that they got the better of the deal. You know where I'm going. The man, the Chinese food for stuff that they were going to throw away, and then my mom, this everyday food for what was going to be a feast of steamed salmon heads and tails with a black bean sauce. And again, I want to thank John for preserving our collective cultural history, and also to my cousin Mel for helping preserve my personal history.
Thank you so much for that moving personal experience sharing, and I'm sure probably if we had another couple of hours, we'd get the other 11 or 12 people here to give some equally poignant stories. But this is partly why I like doing this so much. I learn all these stories. When I first started out, I was writing my own story, and people said, "Oh, that's really interesting." But over the course of the years, I've learned about at least 20 or 30 other stories that are much better or more exciting than my own. So I feel adequately compensated. I don't want to imply, as I said earlier, that chop suey was the only key to Chinese success in the restaurant business. That's what got them into the business. Other factors that might be considered would be taste, just simple taste. Compared to what was available in the mainstream, which was pretty meat and potatoes, kind of, you know, boiled to oblivion vegetables. When I grew up, I couldn't understand why people didn't like vegetables. My mom ran the Chinese restaurant in Macon, Georgia, which was our kitchen. It was the only place where you could get Chinese food. I liked vegetables. I didn't think anything was wrong with them. But now I understand, now that I see how it was prepared in other restaurants. So the Chinese food was more varied, and also there was a huge insistence on freshness, as was implied in what Julie said about Chinese doing the bean sprouts, you know, growing their own. I read one account of some enterprising guy in New York who grew bean sprouts and drove them all the way to Ohio to sell to Chinese restaurateurs. That's how much they were in demand and how much the market was for freshness. Chinese also had an advantage in some sense of low price, which, however, I think in some ways is a disadvantage. But because they were able to rely on family labor, which they didn't pay for, and so they had low overhead and low rent districts, and they also very often lived very close by, if not in or above their store or their restaurant. Might have been a little more difficult to do that than, say, in a grocery store. But nonetheless, many Chinese did that. Partly to save money, also because it was safe, because they wouldn't have to go out at night. They could protect their property by being there, and they wouldn't have to be out on the street at night and worry about being assaulted. And even when they had to hire extra help, they really didn't have to pay them a lot of actual cash because they gave them room and board. However, because Chinese restaurants have a reputation for being inexpensive meals, it's very hard to charge higher prices or be competitive with higher price places, because people have learned that Chinese restaurants are supposed to be inexpensive. Chinese restaurants also had sort of a negative side in the popular image, although it didn't seem to hurt business. When you talk about service in a Chinese restaurant, you are talking about what they call an oxymoron. Chinese restaurants are sort of noted for being abrupt, rude, discourteous, or inattentive, or all of the above, or some combination of things. Now, in defense of these Chinese waiters, I'd like to sort of also point out that given the long hours that they work, under the conditions they work under, and the fact that many of them don't know the language or they don't know the culture, they haven't been here that long, it's not surprising that they're a little rough and kind of unpolished. They're coming from a lower socioeconomic class from where they came, and they're behaving probably in ways that would be acceptable where they were, but not, say, in mainstream America. So that's one negative side about Chinese restaurants. There also is this question about, eventually, how authentic is the food that you get in a Chinese restaurant? Now, I know not everyone asks that, but certainly the foodies, the people who really pride themselves on, knowing what's really the authentic stuff. I think there's no denying that most of the food you get in Chinese American restaurants is not quote-unquote authentic. But this is a sort of a side note here. I couldn't resist putting this question here. Who's the greatest monster in history, Colonel Sanders or General Stowe? In any case, let's suppose we did offer authentic food. So we have these dishes that probably would resonate with people from Guangdong, but how would they do in mid-America? Probably not very well. My friend Grace Jung interviewed a Texas restaurateur and quoted him as saying, "My father always warned us if we served strictly Chinese food, we'd lose the business," which basically means you've got to know your customers. If your customers are primarily not Chinese, you better not try to serve them authentic Chinese food. And that explains why in Rhode Island, at one time, I believe in Providence, one of the most popular items was chop suey sandwiches. Now, the advantage of chop suey sandwiches, you don't need to use chopsticks. You've got two pieces of bread there, right? And so you just pick it up. Sweet and sour pork dishes with really heavy red sauce, gooey red sauce, and pineapples and so forth. It's very popular, but not all that authentic. And here's a dish that I didn't even know about until a couple years ago, but if you run a Chinese restaurant in the area of Springfield, Missouri, and you don't offer Springfield cashew chicken, you will not be patronized by many of the non-Chinese. So I said, what is this? I mean, I read about this, so I looked it up, and the best translation I could get, the simplest, would be, it's fried chicken smothered in brown gravy. Very authentic for Springfield. So you have to be adaptive and creative and to suit your environment. So in New Orleans, in the outskirts, there's a very successful Chinese restaurant that serves Sichuan alligator, okay? And other regional specialties with a Chinese accent on it. And so here's a guy who, you know, came up with things to serve that might not be popular in Minnesota or maybe even in California, but people there like it. And this is a menu that comes from an old restaurant in San Antonio where there's a sort of a mixture of Chinese, American, and Mexican food. And so, again, it shows the regional adaptation, the flexibility of the restaurateur to know its customers. As the Chinese cuisine, Cantonese cuisine began to decline, probably in the late 50s and so forth, for reasons I'll go into in a moment, a lot of other things were tried. There was this adaptation where they tried to piggyback on the success of Polynesian restaurants like Don the Beachcomber and Trader Vic and so forth. So a lot of Chinese, well, I don't know how many, but many Chinese restaurants went the tiki route, and they were popular for a while. And again, that's sort of trying to create an ambience where people feel they have some unusual, exotic experience. And so there was a novelty feature there, and then it sort of fizzled after a while, and it, you know, kind of had its day. Basically, we say people change their interests over time, whether it's clothing fashion or whether it's what's trending in food taste. And so there were changes because, one, in 1965 there was a substantial revision and liberalization of immigration law toward Asian countries, and this was not just China and Taiwan and Hong Kong immigration, but also from Korea and Vietnam and so forth. So there were a lot of new styles of Chinese cooking, New Orleans cooking, Mandarin, Sichuan, Hunan, Shanghai, and these began offering competition for the Cantonese, which was sort of all too familiar to a lot of people, and so they started deserting the old cuisine. When Nixon went to China in the 1970s, 72, and had the big dinner with Mao Zedong and so forth, I can almost remember that within weeks after that, I saw Cantonese restaurants changing their signs out front and putting up Peking and Sichuan, and Kung Pao became the rage because of the publicity that the Nixon trip had. It changed, that also affected people's preferences and interests. As Chinese, Cantonese restaurants increased in popularity over the 30s and 40s and so forth, it became sort of like a diminished quality overall. In other words, there's so many people who can cook well, and then other people jump aboard the bandwagon, but they don't really know how to cook that well. So that sort of hampers or harms the overall reputation of that cuisine. So that would be another reason, was the saturation. And as I said, you know, people wanted to try new things, and so more recently we have competition from the all-you-can-eat buffets, the Bucanese immigrants that all have started coming in large numbers have sort of gone that route in terms of their approach to Chinese restaurants, all-you-can-eat, and also other, not necessarily Chinese, but big corporations are starting to open franchises and chains, and there's a popular Mexican restaurant, I can't remember, it's Chipotle's. They're experimenting with opening, you know, chains of Chinese fast food restaurants. For those of you who love technology, I was just playing around with this. Google has this thing where they, you know, scan like several million books, and you can look up any words and see how they change over time. You see Chop Suey, the red line, had peaked way back in the 20s or 30s and dropped and then leveled off. Then some started going up around the 1965, and crossed over and now exceeds the frequency of Chop Suey. And So in a way, this is a technological reflection parallel to some stuff we all already know. So you could say, in essence, as far as the family Cantonese restaurant background, these images I'm going to show you sort of convey the changing of the guard, the fading of the past. Here's a restaurant in Detroit that used to be a chop suey joint, and then it became a law center, and now it's just sort of an abandoned building. This is a picture from the man that I told you before, artist Leland Wong in San Francisco. This sort of symbolically conveys what I sort of see is that even though there will be family restaurants of Asian background, the newer immigrants who will be coming in will go that route because they start at the bottom of the food chain, so to speak. The other people whose parents ran these restaurants are now all, well not all, but many college-educated professionals and so forth, and they're in other kinds of careers. They're not going to continue these types of restaurants. So that is kind of an overview. I'd be happy to entertain any questions. One of the questions that often comes up is, what is your Chinese name? Can you write it? Well, I usually can't, so I figured, because I only do it once every few months, so I figured I'd write it up here. Those of you who can read Chinese will know immediately that my name is not really Jung. So I confess. But what's interesting is, once I gave a talk to Sacramento, and a woman asked me what my Chinese name was, so I said, I can't remember how to write it, I'll email it to you. So I sent it to her, and then she said, oh, your name is part of a famous Chinese proverb. And I said, oh, really? I didn't know that. You know? She said, yeah, and so she told me, you know, that basically translates into the proverb, when you drink water, remember the source. And that really struck me as incredibly prophetic, that without knowing that what my name meant, I've been trying to live up to it. Thank you.
Don't worry, John. The immigration authorities will deport you because your friends will protect you. I think maybe more than 50% of us also are paper sons. Let's have a raise of hands. Who are paper son names? Oh, not too many. I'm surprised. Okay. But anyway, I'll start with the first question and then one question. How come Chinese restaurant bathrooms are not... Did you take a survey on that one?
What do you mean? I suspect that there people are just way too busy doing all other more essential things first, like getting food prepared. But yeah, it's true that that is not one of people's favorite aspects of Chinese restaurants.
But suppose if they put coin slots in there, do you think if we can? Because bathroom doesn't make money.
They won't go.
Maybe that's But anyway, other questions for John here? If not, I have a second question. Oh, okay.
No, I was just going to say my maternal grandparents started a Chinese restaurant in New York City in the early 1900s.
Oh, fantastic.
And
Chinatown.
yeah, which is very close to Wall Street. And so my mother was born in New York City in 1907.
Good. Good, because earlier we had a raise of hands on whose parents have Chinese restaurants and who work in restaurants. Because please give me your names, because we're going to have a program, a Tuesday program on it. We're always having difficulties or challenges on, after all, it's for 24 years, so every Tuesday we have to have a program, and Kerwin, you are part of the program. I see a question from Jenny.
My father had a restaurant in Oakwood, but they also had gambling.
In the restaurant?
Downstairs.
Oh, downstairs.
Yeah. So I understand in Oakwood there's a lot of that going on the gambling business.
Well, suspect this was probably true in a lot of the Chinatowns as well, but I was fully aware of that, but no. Well, you know, I know they played a lot of mahjong, and that sort of, you know, that wasn't what you're talking about. So you're thinking like there's a little trap door, and you go to the bathroom, and then you open another door, and you get down to the gambling part. That's good to know. Yeah.
How much are the
I'm giving a senior discount because you're my family. I've been here 4 times, so any book, $10. I brought a handful of my old laundry books, and I got one of the Mississippi Delta. I didn't have any of my own memoir, but yeah. So this is the sweet and sour, and if anyone wants to kind of